to help our effort out at the Seawatch this year. As most of you probably know, and as Alison will talk about a little bit, our dawn till dusk 6-week count is a data gathering effort that inventories migratory seabird populations. It's been very fascinating to see how those population trends change over the years now, having done it a decade. But Alison and all of our historic counters need, of course, their attention focused on every loon and surf scoter. And one of the difficulties in such a popular area is every 2 minutes someone coming by and saying, "Oh, how many whales do you see?" Not actually looking for whales. There are whales. So our volunteers, many of whom are affiliated with the museum, have done a great job of coming out and helping Alison do her work, but also engaging with the public, explaining that, oh, hey, yeah, there are hundreds of thousands of migratory seabirds passing by, and there's these different species, and here's where they're from. So your time and your effort and your skill in doing that is also very much appreciated. So thank you guys very much. Upcoming events, of course, it's Christmas count season. Go on the Monterey Audubon website, check out all the local Christmas counts that are coming up. Some of those have been going on for 125 years now, including one on the Monterey Peninsula, 125 years ago. That's pretty exciting. We have a fabulous members-only South Monterey County raptor field trip. If you haven't been to the grasslands east of King City, Greenfield, kind of in the slopes of the Gavilan Ranges out there, especially when it's green, some of the most imaginably beautiful bird life just an hour away. Ruginous hawks, golden eagle, burrowing owl, mountain bluebird, just a wonderful place of our home to go explore if you haven't yet. So lots of ideas for you guys. If you have any questions about the chapter, what we do, feel free to reach out to our executive director, Shannon, who's meeting with Fish and Wildlife right now, or you can reach out to me. We are certainly looking more aggressively than ever for committee members and board members. So if you have a particular area of birds or conservation you're interested in getting our support around, being a volunteer on a committee or board members related to that. I am so glad for the third time to have Alison presenting for us in December. Alison, as all of you know, is the eyes, perhaps now the heart and soul of the Seawatch effort out at Point Pinos. Alison is, in addition to being a very skilled counter, she's one of the best field birders you'll ever meet. She's a wonderful writer and has a really rich and important perspective on many aspects of wildlife, ecology, and conservation. So, Alison, thank you for being with us once again. Feel free to talk about Monterey or Manitou or wherever we're going to go tonight. So, thank you.
Thank you, Blake. All right. Well, thank you so much for showing up tonight. I know it's late for some of you. It's definitely late for me. So we're all in this together. I have spent 9 migrations on Lake Superior, and I'm really excited for the opportunity to bring Lake Superior to Monterey tonight. Before we jump too far into that, however, I would like to provide a brief summary of the keeping watch that I've been doing at our Point Pinos Seawatch since November 1st. Here's just some numbers of the season so far. We have recorded 144 species as of yesterday. I don't think we added anything new today. You can see our most numerous species: Pacific loon, common murre, surf scoter, Bonaparte's gull. The number there is a little bit softer because some of that number came from days where there was just this giant flock milling on the horizon that was very cool to see, but probably some of those birds got double counted. We also had a lot of fun finds that are listed down below the seasonal highlights. Some personal highlights for me that might not be included in that list was a morning where we could hear humpback whales breaching and also feel the slap because it was so still and they were just by the buoy. That was incredible. I really loved sharing the magic of not 1 but 2 short-eared owls, which were my spark bird, with so many of you that great Saturday morning. My friend Rhoda, who a bunch of you have met, has come and visited me for 3 years now, and one of her last days here, she was taking a nap to recover from her life fork-tailed storm petrel. She was like, I don't want any other birds to cross behind my eyes, so she passed out next to me on the bench and was actually asleep, and I woke her up screaming that there was a Nazca booby flying around the point. So that was absolutely a highlight, and I'm so glad that that bird stuck around for so many of us to see. What a fun seasonal highlight. I've also had fun imagining the excitement of Bill and Kai when the wagtail flew by. I'm a little bit disappointed that I didn't get to participate in that fun, but honestly, like, the day off probably meant more to me than the wagtail did. So I'm really excited for everybody that got to see it, and I wish I could have been there to share the excitement, but that's just how it goes. It's your reward for giving me a well-deserved break. And this week I've really been enjoying, we've been having this really cool ancient murrelet flight. There's been a couple days where we've had more than 400 go by the count, which is like a whole season's worth for at least my first year, probably my second year too. And we've been calling them globs. We'll call them out. There's a glob of ancients coming up to the buoy because that's kind of how they move. And sometimes they just smash down into the water and there's a huge splash and they all dive. And we've realized that 20 ancient murrelets make about the same size splash as a sea lion, which is pretty cool. Other than those specific things, I just am very grateful for the opportunity to grow my intimacy with this place. It's become a home for me for sure. And just practicing daily intentional wonder, especially with the people that join me out there. Like, we celebrate those birds that are coming by, and I think that's something that for us personally is very important. And just daily, I've experienced the love of your community, and you take such good care of this count and such good care of its counter. So thank you. All right. Let's get back to Manitou. Every place I've counted has really lodged itself in my heart. Fred used the word wild earlier today, and wild is such an appropriate description of Manitou. This is Manitou Island, and we count there. We stay in that lighthouse, and we get our drinking water from that bay that the wave is crashing over. You have to check the weather to make sure that you're not going to run out of water, because there's some days where you can't get water from that bay. At Manitou, I think the thing that stands out to me most, making it its own sort of special place, is that being on an island and being subject to the same sort of weather conditions that are impacting migration, they're impacting our comings and goings in the same way that they are the birds that we're tallying. And because of that, the degree of separation between us and migration and non-human kinds lessens a lot. And that, to me, is why Manitou Island is such a special place. So let's take a quick look at Manitou. It's about 1,000 acres. It's in Lake Superior. It's only 3 miles from the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula, but the boat ride out there takes quite a bit longer because you're not leaving from the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula. You're leaving from a place called Lac La Belle, and it's like a 22-mile boat ride. It's separated from the mainland by treacherous currents, and there have been times when the boat retrieving us from Manitou Island has left from one dock and had to return to a whole different side of the Keweenaw Peninsula, and we've had to hitchhike back to the original dock. Like, Lake Superior makes all of the rules. And there isn't any one place on Manitou Island where you can't hear waves from Lake Superior crashing somewhere, so you're always reminded of where you are. If you look at the eastern part of the island, that little scoop on the northeastern side, that's where the dock is that we usually get dropped off at. And then at the far eastern side, that point at Manitou Light is where we count. And there have been migration efforts there off and on for the last couple decades. But nothing consistent and nothing long-term because it's just remote and rugged. And then just to put it a little bit into context, the red arrow that's on the Keweenaw Peninsula, that's where the boat leaves from. And the red arrow that's out in the lake, that is Manitou Island. Keweenaw Peninsula, if you're not super familiar with it, it's known for thimbleberries. Trappist monks make them into jam, and it's delicious. It's known for copper mines. It's known for black flies, too. My first visit to Copper Harbor, which is probably the town the Keweenaw is best known for, I was probably 5, and there were field testers from Johnson & Johnson that were testing bug repellent at the same cottages that we were staying at. So that was my introduction to the Keweenaw Peninsula, definitely something it's known for as well. And this is Michigan, because I know that not all of you are super familiar. The red dot in the lower peninsula is where I live, and Manitou is the red in the upper peninsula. It takes about 8 hours to get from our house to the boat launch, and each time those 8 hours have sort of happened on their own terms. They've come a couple days earlier than we've expected them to. So like I said, Lake Superior makes the rules. The habitat composition is mostly state forest, so it's a lot of public land. This is a view just looking down from the light tower, and it gives you a sense of the forest type. There's a lot of birch, there's a lot of spruce, and there's one large inland lake that I've never actually been to because the forest is so dense there that you can't actually walk through it. There are no large mammals on Manitou Island. The largest mammal that there is snowshoe hare, so there's nothing to browse it. If you want to walk around off trail, and there's only one little trail really from the dock to the lighthouse, you have to wear safety goggles. So we don't really do a whole lot of walking around. But someday I will climb a tree and at least see that lake. And then you can see that there's a little sort of yard area around the lighthouse. And that's where we see a lot of really fun birds. I've had Harris's sparrow in that yard. I've had mockingbird in that yard, which is really a fun bird for the far northern Upper Peninsula. This is one of those snowshoe hares. We named them all Bun Bun and Harold, and I couldn't tell you who's Bun Bun, who's Harold. They're all Bun Bun and Harold, but check out the size of that back foot. You know why they're called snowshoe hares now. And they're really tame there because they don't actually have mammal predators. Goshawks do migrate out there, and goshawks can absolutely take a snowshoe hare, but I don't think enough of that happens to make them too fearful. And it's definitely worth talking a little bit about this lighthouse. It was built in the 1860s, and it doesn't have electricity. It kind of has running water, but that's only because of the roof leaks. Every storm that comes through blows a few more shingles off. And it's been occupied mostly by mice since it was automated in the 1980s. The first time that my partner Tripp and I went out there, we ended up killing over 150 mice. Just from the lighthouse, and there were still mice when we left. The only place that you can get cell service on the island is from the top of the light tower, so I started calling it the Tower of the Knowledge of Good and Evil. And I realized out there that knowledge and happiness can sort of be mutually exclusive. Learning about weather through the Tower of Knowledge of Good and Evil didn't always make me happy. Learning about what other sites were getting on their migration counts didn't always make me happy because Manitou migration, it was either boom or bust. There were really good flights, or there were just days where the wind was so strong that nothing was flying. And the first time I was out there was October 2020, and I made the mistake of going up to the light tower at one point and turning my phone on. And my sister had texted me and been like, "Hey, did you know that there was a kidnapping attempt on our state governor?" And yeah, knowledge and happiness, sometimes mutually exclusive. There's definitely some interesting history attached to Manitou Island's lighthouse in the mid-1800s, late 1800s. There were a couple of lightkeepers out there, and I don't know if they actually couldn't swim or if they just didn't like their superior, because their superior came out, his boat capsized, his sailboat capsized, and they didn't actually attempt to save him, so he drowned. And the guy who was writing this was livid, of course, that the lightkeepers at the life-saving station had just sort of not done their job. And he wrote, "Could not find anyone competent that wants to go." And I thought about that competency when we came out there. If you look at these photos taken from a game cam that we brought out with us, the jury is definitely still out, competent watchkeepers. But I have been to Manitou 3 times. The first couple projects were through Copper Country Audubon, and those were because the organizer and the overseer of those projects is kind of obsessed with how waterbirds and hawks move across Lake Superior and how those flight lines might connect. And in the left photo, that's Tripp and myself, and Tripp had just caught this huge lake trout, and we were carrying it from the dock to the yard, and we ate lake trout and only lake trout for that meal because we didn't have a way of keeping it cool, so we just gorged ourselves. It was delicious. And then in this picture on the right is Tim, who came out to Manitou at the end of that same October trip, because Youngman, the man organizing it, was like, Manitou is way too remote to have one person out there for 4 weeks. So you'll be out there for 2 weeks, and then Tim will be out there for 2 weeks. And that's sort of how our relationship with Manitou started. The things that have stayed the same from trip to trip on Manitou is just crazy big flights when you least expect them, a lot of mice, and you don't get visitors, which is kind of unusual. And the different migration sites that I've worked, the only non-project related visitors that I've had were actually the Coast Guard came out. Unfortunately, not because we needed them to come out. This was the second time that Tripp and I were out in spring of 2021. And this boat came up and they were pulling old batteries off the island, but they hadn't really made their calculations right. And the batteries exceeded the weight that the boat was allowed to take back. And so we were stuck with some of the Coast Guard crew that afternoon because they experienced the same thing that we did. They got back to the mainland, the weather switched. They had to trailer the boat over to the other side of the peninsula, come back. And we're like, how long are we going to have to hang out with these guys? Are they going to eat all our food? But fortunately, they left that afternoon. They were really concerned about making their bowling tournament in Hancock that evening, so they had motivation to get off the island. But captured by that same game camera that got all of us in it is something else that sort of inspired the project that I'm about to share with you about the work that we did out there this spring. And in case it's not super apparent, do you see it now? Yeah. So owl migration on Manitou Island had been completely unknown. I had a few short-eareds coming in off the lake during the 2 times that I was out there. I would climb the light tower to watch sunset, and one of those nights I saw a long-eared owl fly off to the west towards Duluth. But other than that, nobody really knew how owls used Manitou and how many owls used Manitou. And nobody had ever banded any birds of any type on Manitou Island, though we had done these migration surveys. And Tim, my friend, had just gotten his master banding permit. So banding is a very highly permitted and controlled thing because you're handling birds. You have to be careful. You have to know what you're doing. You have to be ethical. And Tim had just gotten that approval to be able to have his own banding projects. And he was really excited to make Manitou his first banding project. But the pieces hadn't all quite come together yet. If you're not familiar with banding, it's the practice of catching a bird, usually in a mist net, and getting a small aluminum band, fitting it carefully on its leg, and that band has a unique number on it. So if that bird is either caught again at another banding station, or with cameras now, we can sometimes get photographs of banded birds. We learn a lot about where they live, where they go, how long they live. So it's especially useful for birds like owls that we don't see a lot of going about our normal activities. I do want to just mention Tim a little bit. So I've known Tim since I was like 6 or 7, and my mom actually taught his sister piano growing up. We were friends in childhood. We did a lot of birding together, and then he got competitive and I got competitive. So we were sort of enemies and didn't actually talk to each other for about 12 years. And then we ended up working on the same project while we were still not talking to each other. And it was great because it was when I was on Manitou and then he was on Manitou, and we only saw each other as we were sort of passing the baton at the dock. But because of the inherent struggles that come with Manitou, Tim and I became close friends through that. And yeah, I'm very glad that Tim is one of my friends now because he's a good person to have in your life. The picture in the upper right probably deserves some explanation. That was actually just taken a couple weeks ago when my sister and I were driving out here. A woman who's like a grandmother to both my sister and I, as well as Tim, had given us 48 cookies. And so to make her happy, we're like, wouldn't it be fun if we took a picture of a cookie every time we eat one in a cool place? And so that's Tim running his banding station in New Mexico at the Manzanos, which is a hawk watch project, and the sharp-shinned hawk and a cookie. And Tim is also a skilled diesel mechanic, as you might have guessed. It's his truck with my truck and canoes. We get along pretty well now. But anyway, Tim had quite a few goals for this Manitou project that he had been sort of dreaming about. He had been counting hawks at a site called Brockway on the Keweenaw Peninsula, not far from where you leave to go to Manitou. And he just had been imagining how great the hawk migration is on Manitou and how great it would be if we could actually quantify it through banding. And so he wanted to know whether or not owls in migration visit Manitou. He wanted to take a look at the condition of the birds that we would be catching on Manitou, or that we hope to be catching on Manitou, because one of the things that you do when you're banding is you examine like whether there's food in the crop, you blow on the feathers on the belly and see how their fat reserves are, and then you also like lift their wings and blow on their wing pits and gently feel to see how the wing pit fat is. And he wanted to know if the birds that were on Manitou were eating well or if they were skinny and hungry in migration, which is normal. Wanted to get like a better idea of how many migratory raptors there were, because seems like a lot, but is it the same 30 sharp-shinned hawks circling around the yard, or are they like 90? Banding would be a great way to figure some of that out. And because of where Manitou Island is situated in relation to other Great Lakes banding stations, we thought it would be a good place to potentially capture hawks that might have already been banded at other sites. And I'll show you that on the next slide. Here, the red dots are other sites that do banding around Lake Superior, and Mackinac Straits is sort of at the conjunction of Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And yeah, those places are all situated that we're like, oh, look, Manitou's in the middle of all that. Wouldn't it be a great place to see if we can both catch birds that other people have already caught and hope that some of the birds that we catch make it to those other sites? So anyway, Tim called me up on a Tuesday night and said, hey, can you catch a boat on Thursday to Manitou for 10 days? And that was this spring. That was in May. And I said, I don't know. Let me check with my manager. And she said, go. And I said, thanks. I had been planning to do a migration count on Isle Royal, but the permit had fallen through, and I was feeling really sad about missing out on a season of intentional observation of migration. And so I feel like a journey begins when you realize the first thing that you forgot. And I was about 2 hours from my house when I realized I had forgotten my tripod. Fortunately, it's an 8-hour drive. I knew people along the way, so I'm calling my friends. I'm like, hey, do you have a spare tripod? And one of them did. And I was officiating his wedding later that summer, so he owed me a favor. So I went out to Manitou with a tripod. But this is how we get to Manitou. That boat in the upper left is not very big. There's a fishing charter service with a really, really great captain, Captain Travis, and he's taken us out to Manitou every time that I've gone out there. And we've learned that outrunning bad weather is just like a key part of all of those trips to Manitou. You're always packing with the possibility that you're going to be staying on the island for longer than you intended. You're making sure that you're packed ahead of time in case the boat leaves early. A lot of the time that we're on Manitou, we're listening to weather reports on the Marine Band radio and hearing that, there's waves forecasts that are about the same length as this boat, which is 22 feet. Superior can do some pretty gnarly things. Superior makes the rules. And so the lower left photo is just a picture of leaving Lac La Belle to go out to the passage between Keweenaw Peninsula and Manitou Island. And the right is sort of a snapshot of the gear we had. We had a chainsaw, we had a solar panel, we had game collars, because to band owls, you're using recordings of their calls to lure them into the nets. We had spotting scopes, a lot of food, a lot of mouse traps, a ground blind. We had 6 pigeons, we had 2 house sparrows. It was quite an ordeal. And the pigeons were a little bit stressed by the boat ride out, but we covered them with a tarp and they seemed to do better. And this is the dock at Manitou. We usually land there, but there was classically bad weather coming in, and Captain Travis was like, how about we see if we can just nose into Square Bay, which is right next to the lighthouse. And he was able to do that, which saved us from carrying our gear down a trail that's like a mile long, and nobody had been down it since winter, so it certainly was going to have a lot of fallen down trees across it. So Square Bay is right here. That's where we got dropped off. And we quickly hustled our gear from that gravel beach up to the trail, up to the lighthouse. And as I was doing all that, Tim realized that neither one of us knew where the key was for the lighthouse. So it was quite a way to start the trip. And I was carrying all the gear from the beach to the trail, because I would much rather have done that than to crawl through the crawl space of the lighthouse. Probably nobody had been down there for a very long time except dozens of mice, and Tim was doing that and opening a window, and even then we had to pass all of our gear through the window because the lock was a padlock, so it's not like we could open the lighthouse from the inside. So for the first couple days we were out there, like every time one of us had to go outside for something, it was going in through the window. And this is sort of the scenes that greeted us on Manitou on our arrival. There's winter wren songs everywhere, winter wren scolding every time you stepped off the trail into their domain. So many sharp-shinned hawks that you could hear them sort of just like clattering through the spruce branches. And there were old puffballs from the fall before, snowshoe hare, fur, and skeletons everywhere. It's just kind of a cool time of year, not quite winter, not quite spring. And greeting us on Manitou is what I've come to call the Welcome Committee. They're sort of out there like Statue of Liberty. Give us your downtrodden, your weary, but they don't really want to do nice things with the weary. It's a peregrine falcon on the left and a sharp-shinned hawk on the right, and there's just literally this row of small raptors that are out there in wait for tired songbirds coming in. And I've not seen anything quite like that at other sites that I've counted at. You'll have a little bit of that. Even at Pinos, we have a merlin or a peregrine that hangs around and tries to hunt the yellow rumps. But at Manitou, tired birds coming in from the lake, it's like they're running a gauntlet to actually access the island. And something that's interesting to me is that in spring migration, you expect to hear a lot of bird song. On Manitou, there is no bird song. It's quiet or there's alarm calls. There's no singing. It's not time to be happy if you're a prey bird. And there are just feather piles everywhere. Sharp-shinned hawks are bird eaters, and that's what the ground looks like on Manitou in the spring. Everywhere you walk, under every tree, there's a pile of feathers. So this is what the lighthouse looked like when we came in. Accessing from the yard, it was sort of a foggy, rainy afternoon, and it was kind of a fun game because I climbed in through the window once Tim broke in. Tim was like, I'll get the gear. We had so much heavy gear, and we didn't want it to get wet even though we had tarps. And he was like, I'll carry it from the trailhead to the lighthouse. So I was like, cool. I just kind of like hefted myself in through the lighthouse window. And we had a couple windows open. It was a fun game. It's like, what window is Tim going to come to? Never the one that I thought he was going to. And what is he going to hand me? It would be like a hatchet and birds, or a can of gasoline and birds. And that was life on Manitou. For a couple days, everything required passage through that window, including eventually handing hawks to each other through that window to ban them inside. We were like, we could have a really cool ice cream stand here. I ended up not sleeping inside the lighthouse. It's kind of moldy, really mousy. So I asked him, I was like, do you care if I sleep on the light tower? Like, you're not going to do that, are you? And he said no. So I had my coffee, I had my mat. It was great. I could just wake up when it was light and start counting migration. And like I said before, you feel really close to migration on Manitou. And it's a much slower migration usually than it is at Pinos. At Pinos, I feel like you can get a whole season's worth of superior migration in a day. You don't expect that to happen every day here, but it can happen every day. And on Manitou, I was like, oh, this is going to be wonderful. I'm just going to hang out on the light tower. I'm going to take a scan. I'm going to write a sentence in my journal about like what I saw in that scan and just like have this be a writing retreat of sorts. And I was up doing that while Tim was down sort of setting up the nuts in the yard. And we had a really nice common loon flight that first day. I think I had 800 over the course of that day, which is a really good tally for Lake Superior. And it was fun too. I was like, when do I want to stop my lake watch for the day? There's no protocol. I'm making the protocol. So I decided it would be when I had 10 loonless scans. And that took me 6 hours from when I started to have 10 loonless scans. And I also really appreciated how wonderful it was to have an iron lighthouse for a shelter. Like, you always could be in the lee of that light tower, and there was nothing that was getting through to you. So there was no tripod shake. I was warm. Sometimes the sunny side wasn't the windless side, but it all worked out. And pretty soon, the sky started to look like this. When you're on Manitou, even sometimes on the boat ride coming out, there's just big kettles, turkey vultures, red-tailed hawks, broad-winged hawks, rough-legged hawks, golden eagles here and there, and lots of sharp shins. And it's wonderful. You can just lay down and look up and see that. So I was enjoying migration, and I think Tim was stressing out about how am I going to get the best net set up in this place that I've never banded before. And I let that be his problem for a while and just wrote a little bit about what I was seeing. Like I said, I would take a scan and write, so a loon westbound over the cloud bank, and the first kestrel, a male, nimbly tumbling over the water. Then a female lighting next to me on a spruce top. Another loon on the same line, same height, like a drip feed for my soul, and another, just now, naked eye that I put in the scope because I could and I should. If you swing your scope west today, it seems any piece of sky that direction has a dozen broad wings, a red tail. Down below, a sharpie in its shadow, sowing the threat of death on sparrow bush. Below, nothing. 3 long-tailed ducks in the peat-muck plumage of their summer homes getting there, as the longtail flies. Today, the hawks seem more intent on killing than they do migrating. The sharpies woke up hungry. Drama, squeals from below. At least 3 sharpshins went for the same target. 2 left quickly, but one, a second year, remained, her wings out, tented like she was trying to prevent an escape. She stayed like this till she was satisfied that wouldn't work, and then she began to stalk through the long winter-dead grass, pouncing occasionally with long yellow toes, coming up empty each time. 7 herring gulls versus 1 sharpshinned, handicapped by hundreds of meters of open water in a headwind. Time of death, who knows? Herring gulls dismember their victims, but time of no return, 9:00 a.m. I thought that I was going to have a whole week of that, which would have been pretty awesome. But meanwhile, Tim was down below setting up his banding setup. And this is called a dogaza, or a DG setup. Basically, it's a triangle of mist nets on triggers so that when a bird hits the net, you have a bait bird in the middle, and I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. It's not as bad as it sounds. And Tim is wonderful to his lure birds. They all have names. But anyway, there's this triangle of mist nets that are sort of set up around your lure bird in the middle, which could be a pigeon, could be a house sparrow, could be a starling. And the hawk is approaching from the outside of the net, and it hits the net, and the net's on this trigger system, so it just collapses, and then you run to the net and gently take the hawk out. And it is a very effective way of trapping hawks, particularly smaller ones. And also inside this setup, we had something called a bow net, which is really useful for larger raptors that might actually be able to hurt your lure bird. So for example, it wasn't actually a large raptor, it was just a female sharp-shinned hawk that was determined that she was going to kill a pigeon that was probably heavier than she was. And she rode that pigeon all the way over to the bow net, and you have a peg in the bow net so that when you trip the bow net, if that pigeon is at the peg and the hawk's on the pigeon, you know that that net is not going to spring in a way that's going to hurt either the pigeon or the hawk. So we had a bow net inside of this setup, and then Tim built a little house for the pigeon out of rocks and pieces of wood so that when we weren't raising and lowering the pigeon so that it would flap, it had a little house that was a shelter that it could rest in. And here is a picture of the little vests that the pigeons wear. So we had 5 pigeons out there, and like I said, Tim takes such good care of his lure birds. We brought 6 pigeons out, and we left with 6 pigeons. We brought 2 house sparrows out. We left with 1 house sparrow, but we don't know why the other one died. We never got a chance to use it in banding. Maybe it wasn't in good shape to start with. But yeah, we had with us Midnight, Gray Boy, Wheezy, Junior, Queen Frostine, and Junior. And with these pigeons, they wear like this really heavy-duty leather vest so that when a hawk comes in on them, the hawk's going to grab the pigeon, but the pigeon is not going to get hurt. And there's a D-ring, which you can see in the right picture, and you run a line through that D-ring, and then those lines come back to a blind that you're sitting in that's probably 30 yards away. And you're using those lines to raise and lower the pigeon. And Tim has, I think they're called like Portuguese racing pigeons or Portuguese tumbling pigeons. They're not just ordinary rock doves. Like, they specifically are flashy and they flap, which gets the attention of a hawk that's cruising by. So you raise and lower them and they flap, and you only do that with 1 pigeon for like 15 or 20 minutes, and then you give it a break. And Tim was really, really vigilant to make sure that we didn't use any birds too much and that none of his birds got injured. We had one injury that wasn't related to banding that I'll talk a little bit about later, but it all worked out. And then this is just sort of an overview of where the nets were. The big red squares where we had the pigeon DG setup. The blind is the arrow that's in the middle. And then eventually we added another mist net setup with the house sparrow inside of it. And that was up sort of on a ridge. This is just a better look at that ridge. And to go back to the other slide, hawks would approach straight over the island, so coming like straight at the red square. So once they got to that open yard, they had like a clear line of view. They're like, oh, there's a pigeon, I'm hungry. And Tim thought that would be a really good way to get hawks. And I actually watched Tim catch the first sharp-shinned of this excursion while I was in the light tower. I was like looking down, I was like, oh cool, the pigeon's flapping. And then all of a sudden there was a hawk in the net and Tim was running out to the net. And this was the first ever raptor banded on Manitou Island. It was a sharp-shinned hawk, a second-year bird. Most of the ones we caught were second-year birds. And we met with a lot of success very quickly. The banding process, sort of start to finish an overview, is you take the bird out of the net and you put it in one of these cans. The can keeps the bird sort of controlled, contained, and also calmer. They're not freaking out as much. Then you sort of gingerly pull a leg out of the can and hope that that leg, the other leg, doesn't grab you in the hand. And you put the band on the leg, then you get some measurements, you weigh the bird, you measure the wings, you measure the tail, you take the fat measurements that I was talking about earlier, you note the age and the molt, and all of this is recorded meticulously and sent back to the bird banding lab, and then you do the release, which is really fun. But yeah, pretty soon the house started to look like this. There were just sharp-shins and cans. And Tim was like, hey, I know that you thought that you were just going to be out for the buddy system, so if, something went wrong and I got hurt, you could call the Coast Guard or whatever for help. But he's like, guess what? I need you to learn how to band. And I had some bird handling experience before, but I had never put a band on a bird before. And I was like, okay, I'm going to be your assistant bander. I wasn't planning on that. And I know that it's only been recent since we started liking each other again. So I hope that this is going to work out okay. And fortunately, Tim was a really, really patient instructor. And it was really hard for me to just be thrown into this. And I am a perfectionist to a fault. And I wanted to be good at the birds. I wanted to do it right. It's like a very meticulous process to get the band on the bird and make sure that it's not overlapped, make sure that it's closed properly. And Tim was a huge stickler for making sure that all of my bands were perfect, which I'm really glad for. But I would hand him my first few bands and be like, is this good? And he'd be like, nope, you got to tap it here, tap it there. And it's just, you've got the small leg of a bird in your hand. And it feels like if you just close that band too tightly, you're going to be causing really, really bad damage. And I didn't, because I was erring very much on the side of caution. But it was really stressful at first. And yeah, I wanted to be kind to the lure birds and not be jerking the pigeons around. There's a way to flap them that's not quite so stressful, and it's really hard to get that finesse. And I wanted to be kind also to the birds that we were catching. And this is a merlin that we caught. And the hawks didn't really give me the same sort of, they didn't really care about being nice to me, even though I wanted to be nice to them. And I remember writing in my journal that Tim was a very patient teacher and the sharp-shins were not. His methods were a lot less painful than the sharp-shins, and the sharp-shins were ruthless. I was like, I know now why they called them sharp. At the end of our time there, I was taking a sharp-shinned hawk out of the net, and Tim overheard me saying to this hawk, you can bite me, but please don't foot me. And Tim was like, you've moved up. He's like, you've graduated. But yeah, my hands got beat up, and at night I would just be treating my hands with rubbing alcohol and triple antibiotic, trying to make sure that I did not get an infection on this island that would be a very bad place to have an infection. Unfortunately, none of that happened. Evenings were definitely for tending wounds out there. And we ended up banding 81 sharp-shinned hawks over the course of the 10 days that we were out there, which was just unprecedented. When you go to a new place to band, it takes a while to get the optimal setup. And fortunately, what Tim thought was going to worked really well. But we were not mentally prepared for 81. We're like, this is great. We would have been happy catching 5 birds, but we got 81. And it's really fun, like working the pigeon so that the hawk comes in at the right angle to actually get caught in the net. It's kind of like playing pool, lining up a pool shot. And we would sometimes catch like 4 sharp-shinned hawks at the same time. It was just chaos. With the house sparrow set up on the ridge that I had mentioned earlier, there was one time that for some reason we weren't running that line to the blind. I think it's because it was really windy and the net kept tumbling down, so we had to actually sit out there with it. But the sharpshins didn't care. I was sitting there just like raising and lowering the house sparrow, because you can't pop the house sparrow like you would a pigeon. That would kill the house sparrow. And so you're just like gently raising and gently lowering, and it's flapping a little bit. And it felt like I was sitting in the school of sharks, because these sharp-shinned hawks were just like coming out and swirling, and it never took us very long to catch a bird. Another side note is that Tim used to work in the same hardware store as my sister did, and my sister was a lot when she was a teenager, and Tim decided to name all of the nastiest sharp-shinned hawks after my sister. So he's like, that's an Audra, that's an Audra. And we told my sister about that, and she thought it was pretty great too. We didn't only catch sharpshins out there, we also banded 4 merlins, and sharpshins are like pretty quiet in the hand. Merlins are not. They scream and they are loud, and it would almost be a relief to put them back in the can, because then they weren't just piercing your ears. You can see a little bit in that left picture of the blind that we were sitting in while we were catching these birds. We caught 2 American kestrels. They were both females. We caught both of those on the sparrows. Some of them did show interest in the pigeons, but they had the sense to not try to catch a bird that was much bigger than they were. But yeah, they were too small to do a whole lot of damage, so I loved handling them, and they're so beautiful. It was really cool to see all of these birds in hand that I oftentimes only see through binoculars or a spotting scope. My favorite bird that we caught actually was northern harrier. We caught 2 of them, and the one pictured here is a female. The males of this age are still brown, but they have yellow eyes. The females have brown eyes. And this was a bird that we caught, I think, our second to last day of banding, and it felt really good to me because I was running the pigeon when she came in, and harriers are not quite as, their prey drive is a little bit different from a sharp-shinned hawk. Like, you have to set things up a little bit better to actually get a harrier into the net, because they're like, this pigeon, something's wrong with it, and they'll peel off, or maybe they'll see the net. But I was running the pigeon, and then I was able to extract her without a whole lot of assistance from Tim out of the net, and I banded her and I released her. So it was cool. I got to do her from start to finish, and just really appreciated seeing one of my favorite birds in hand. I fell in love with her a little bit. We tried to find time for other things out there than just banding, but there weren't very many hours of the day when hawks weren't flying. And daily domestic duties were cleaning the lighthouse. Sometimes if we had the door open, or the window open, which we had to do for those first few days, songbirds would let themselves in. So in my hands are 2 white-throated sparrows. You can see the color difference between those birds. It's pretty cool. So that was part of the daily duties was cleaning the house of birds. And then I did poke around in the yard and found some morel mushrooms, which was a really nice addition to the beans and rice diet. And then when night came around, our work wasn't done, because Tim wanted to band owls too. And we would start off tending our wounds. We had a pigeon that, unfortunately, so the first day that we were there, Tim thought that he would give his pigeons some fresh air, and he had them out in the yard, but the gauge of the metal on his cage was enough that sharpshins with their long, thin legs, one of them was able to grab in and nailed his pigeon in the eye. And we were putting poultices on this pigeon's eye every night. So I'd be tending my own wounds and then sitting with this pigeon in my lap next to the heat lamp with a poultice over her eye. And we did not use this pigeon, of course, for a lure bird while we were on the island, but she recovered, and she's been retired now. Tim has a whole flock of pigeons at his family's barn, and she just flies around with them. But yeah, it would get dark, and then Tim would go out and set up nets for owls. You use collars to attract owls in, so it would be cool hearing him start the saw-whet collar, and then the long-eared collar, and then when I heard the boreal collar, I knew that he would be coming back to the lighthouse soon. And we'd just hang out and listen to music and play cards and wait and go and check the nets like every 30 minutes. And we had no idea what the owl migration was going to be like on Manitou, and we also came out a little bit later in the season than we would have wanted to get the peak of it. Tim was like, yeah, I think the long-eareds have really stopped moving. However, we did catch quite a few saw-whets and long-eareds. There's nothing that's cuter than a saw-whet owl, and their personality is also really cute. They're pretty docile in hand, and Tim and I joked about making the lighthouse sort of an earn your keep sort of thing. We're like, yeah, owls, like if you want to stay here, you got to eat some mice. And in fact, one of the nights that we were banding a long-eared in the house, there was a mouse that started walking across the floor, and it just kind of looked up and saw the owl and went back to where it came from. We're like, this is great. We just need a house owl is what we need. But yeah, the owl migration ended up being so much better than we thought that it was going to be. And because of that, they were actually hitting nets more quickly than we could process them. And there was one point in the night where Tim was like, yeah, I have to shut this net down because they're outrunning us. And so while Tim was shutting the net down, he gave me a satchel of 8 saw-whet owls, all in their little Campbell soup cans. And he's like, go release them. And so I went down the trail, past all the nets, and I just felt like a little fairy with my satchel of saw-whets. I'd take them out of the can, I'd let them go, I'd take another one, I'd take it out of the can, let it go. It was wonderful. And meanwhile, Tim was dealing with long-eareds, which are not nearly so nice in the hand as saw-whets. They're pretty ruthless, but also beautiful. So that was incredible. The only problem was that we never really slept. Tim would stay up later than I would, and I would get up earlier than Tim would. And Tim would be like, hey, wake me up when you see, it was 12. He's like, wake me up when you see 12 sharpshins at the same time. And usually that happened around 8 o'clock in the morning, and he was like, no. We drank a lot of coffee while we were out there. We'll go back to that. But anyway, some of the takeaways, during the 10 days that we were out there, it wasn't quite 10 days actually that we were banding, we caught 88 diurnal raptors and we caught 35 owls. And during that same time period, Mackinac Straits, which was banding, they're in the lower right of this map, they got a lot fewer birds than we did. They got 20 hawks and 8 owls. In a lot of places in the Great Lakes, the hawk flight doesn't really start until mid-morning, and it really tapers off in mid-afternoon. And on Manitou, that wasn't the case. Basically, the sun came up, the Sharpies got up, and they stayed up until the sun went down. So we were putting in really long days of banding. Some of our busiest banding days on Manitou were actually days where the weather seemed pretty bad. Northeast winds in the spring there are the worst, and they will just really shut down hawk migration at most sites that Tim and I have watched migration at. Wasn't the case on Manitou. Those were some of our best days, in fact. And my favorite part of banding hawks on Manitou was learning that the hawks that we were catching, they were almost all in really good shape. We would feel the crops, and most of them would be like full or half full, which meant that that bird had eaten within 24 hours. They would have wing pit fat, like they would have a fat layer over their keel. So these were birds that were not starving. And unfortunately, the songbirds on Manitou Island probably had a different idea of how great or not great this was. But it's always nice to see that birds are doing well on just like an incredibly physically taxing journey. And Tim had really hoped that we would get some recaptures. We did. We caught 2 sharp-shinned hawks that had already been banded, and they had both been banded at Whitefish Point. One of them had been banded 2 springs prior, but the other one was super awesome. It had been banded just a few days before we caught it on Manitou, so it had flown 250 miles northwest to Manitou within that period of time, and she was in great shape. She was an adult female, which you can tell from the gray plumage. And we're looking forward to finding out whether those 81 sharpshins that we caught, whether or not they'll get recovered in other places. And we caught one already banded saw-whet, and it had been banded in Wisconsin in the previous fall. And 4 of the saw-whets that we caught on that night that I had the little satchel of saw-whets, 4 of those caught in that night have been already caught again that we know of. 2 of them were caught 3 days later in Copper Harbor because Tim went back to Copper Harbor and was like, well, I'm just going to keep banding here. And so he caught 2 of those again. One was caught 13 days later at Whitefish Point. So it was interesting. The sharp-shinned hawk had moved west to get to Manitou Island. The saw-whet hawk that same season had moved east to get to Whitefish Point. And then one of our other saw-whets was caught this past fall in a banding station in Minnesota. And I'll go back to that map so that you can see. It was a little bit northeast of Duluth. So very curious to know what that owl did between Manitou in spring and Toft, Minnesota in the fall. But one really cool thing that both Tim and I sort of try to approach migration with is just appreciating the lives that we're witnessing, and in this case, the lives that we're touching. This was the 3rd to the last hawk that we caught. It was a broad-winged hawk, which you don't catch a lot of buteos, especially broadwings. And I remember Tim holding this bird and just saying, you know, you've been to more places in the last 2 months because broadwing hawks winter in the Amazon. He's like, you've been to more places in the last 2 months than I've been to in my life. And whenever we released a hawk, we wish them good luck. This is a rough-legged hawk on Manitou. We didn't catch any roughies, but hopefully that will change in a season to come. Tim does have the future goal of Manitou to have a full 2-month field season and to also get transmitters or modus tags to place on sharp-shinned hawks, long-eared owls, and saw-whet owls, just so that we can learn a little bit more about where these birds are going and how they're doing it. And yeah, every time I see a hawk set off across Lake Superior, I have so many questions. And I feel like some of those answers came just from the little period that we were banding on Manitou, and I'm hoping to find some more of those answers if we can make it out for a field season, which we're both actively working on. So thank you so much for showing up tonight, and yeah. Do you guys have any questions? Because I am happy to answer them to my ability. Yeah, I'll start with you.
At night on top of the lighthouse, did you happen to see the northern lights?
Yes, I am so glad that you brought that up. The aurora was really active during that period of time. As you might remember, it was early May of this year. And unfortunately, Manitou is like usually cloudy. So people were seeing the aurora really well in other areas, but we were able to see like a faint green glow on the horizon, which was still incredible to be sleeping on a light tower with Superior right below and seeing the aurora with like no other signs of humans other than where we were. Yeah, thank you for asking that. All right, and there was a question. What kind of can is a long-eared dove? Amarula can. It's a kind of liqueur. They also fit really well in cans that Scotch bottles come in. Don't ask me how I know these things.
And it just become tranquil in the can?
Yeah, they don't have a lot of places where they can move and lash out. Like getting them out of the can is definitely an exciting process, but it makes it better for them and it makes it better for us. And also another thing that you do with owls, you put them back into the can before you release them so that their eyes have a chance to adjust back to being dark. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Amanda.
Did Tim have any funding to do this, or where was the source of his ability to just go out and band birds?
He had one small grant, and then the boat out there was the biggest expense, and somebody very kindly paid for that. That's why the trip was so last minute. But yeah, he went to the Raptor conference that just happened in Duluth, And seems like he made a lot of really good connections there for potential funding for a field season, because people were looking at his data and just being like, wait, you did what and had what? And nobody's heard of this place? Like, yeah, you got to get out there. So, yeah. Yeah.
How is the lighthouse powered?
Trip.
Yes,
How is the lighthouse powered?
a series of batteries the Coast Guard maintains.
Okay.
Yeah, it's basically automated, it's a 12-volt system.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had like old submarine batteries out there, what Alison was talking about earlier, where they came out to pull the old batteries out. They were like from the 50s, and they didn't even know that they were out there still, so when they found that out, they had to take them out. Yeah, they were just out there to service the current batteries.
Yeah. And they had solar panels too, right?
Yeah, they had solar panels, but they were like kind of dodgy. But I think
Everything on
I
Manitou is kind of dodgy.
Only 3/4 of them were actually functioning. It's a pretty rough area. Like,
Yeah.
It's a lot of hard weather.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, Amanda, and then over here.
Just broadly speaking, you might say all times of year, but what's the best time to visit the Great Lakes for birding?
I would say May. Absolutely May. You have a really good diversity of species. They're in breeding plumage, breeding behavior, and the weather is a little bit better than fall. Yep. I would say around Memorial Day weekend is a great time, and like, please seek me out. I'm happy to help you plan your trips. Yeah. Yeah.
This is kind of a basic question, because you mentioned that one of the birds that you knew had come from the Amazon. And so I'm trying to like picture the map and picture that, so this is spring, so they're going north. And do you know where all these sharpshooters are, how far they have come and where they were headed for? Or did any of them stay on Manitou, or is this a stopping place just for a night, or kind of just
Yeah, so sharp-shinned hawks are actually very little known for how numerous they are, and that's why Tim in particular is hoping to put some tags on them. It's likely that some of them stay on Manitou to nest, but not the hundreds that we were seeing every day. They are definitely a northern forest nester. They do nest in like the northern lower peninsula, but most of their nesting habitat in the Great Lakes region is the upper peninsula in Canada. And as far as where they winter, it's sort of the interior southern United States for that population, but some of them also go to Central America, which are things that we've learned through banding data. Yeah, were there other parts to your question that I didn't answer?
that's a great answer.
Okay, great. Anything else? All right, right on. Well, thank you so much, guys.